Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. March 2007. The air at 2 in the morning is sharp and cold, carrying the particular dryness of high desert that burns the throat with every breath. A joint operations center hums with electronic equipment. Screens display satellite imagery, updated by the minute. Radio channels carry traffic in multiple languages. The targeting list pinned to the briefing board contains 47 names. Tomorrow night, it will contain 52. The week after that, 60-1. In one corner of the operations center, 2 British SAS officers study the intelligence package for the night's proposed operation. They have been reviewing the material for 40 minutes. The target is a mid-level Taliban commander, a genuine threat. The intelligence placing him at a specific compound is solid, triple-sourced, and recently confirmed. The case for action is strong, but the proposed method troubles them. The American plan calls for a full assault element, helicopter insertion, fast rope entry to the compound, simultaneous breach of 3 entry points, and a 5-minute clearance timeline. The compound is in a village. The village has a population of several hundred people. The intelligence notes the presence of women and children in the compound. The 5-minute clearance timeline and the scale of the assault force carry implications that the British officers are not willing to accept. One of them closes the intelligence folder. He looks at his counterpart. Neither speaks for a long moment. The next morning, the British element formally withdrew from the operation. The Americans proceed without them. The operation achieves its objective. The target is killed. 14 other people were also killed, 5 of them later confirmed as non-combatants. The village that was neutral before the raid becomes, within the week, a reliable source of Taliban recruits. In the after-action review, the British SAS commander submits a written assessment that contains a phrase that will circulate through Allied Special Operations channels for years. The tactical objective was achieved at strategic cost. No competent analysis could justify. This was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern, and the pattern had a name: the acceleration of American Special Operations tempo into something that the British and Australian SAS could neither recognize as sound doctrine nor participate in with clear professional conscience. To understand how the alliance broke requires going back to the beginning, to the days after September 11th, 2001, when the nature of the alliance was forged in shared grief and genuine common purpose. The attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon united the Tian English-speaking world in a way that hadn't been seen since the Second World War. Britain's Prime Minister Blair's declaration of solidarity was immediate and unconditional. Australia's Prime Minister Howard, who happened to be in Washington on September 11th, invoked the ANZUS Treaty within hours, committing Australia to the American response. For the special operations communities, the response was operational as well as political. British and Australian SAS elements were among the first Allied forces to enter Afghanistan in October 2001, working alongside American Special Operations forces in the initial campaign to topple the Taliban government. In those early weeks, the alliance was seamless. The forces shared doctrine forged in common heritage, mutual training, and years of joint exercises. They had operated together in the Gulf War, in the Balkans, in various training exercises that had deliberately stress-tested their interoperability. They were, by any professional measure, a unified special operations capability. The early Afghanistan campaign reinforced this unity. The British SAS, operating in the South, provided intelligence and direct action capability that proved crucial in the collapse of Taliban resistance. The Australian saucer deployed to Afghanistan and established itself as a formidable reconnaissance and direct action force. American Special Operations forces worked alongside them with the easy familiarity of long-standing alliances. There were differences in method, as there always were, but the differences were manageable because everyone was pointed in the same direction toward the same objective. The objective was clear in 2001. Destroy al-Qaeda's Afghan sanctuary, topple the Taliban regime that had provided it, and prevent Afghanistan from being used again as a base for catastrophic terrorism. These were achievable objectives with definable success conditions. They were objectives that British and Australian SAS could pursue with complete professional commitment. Then the objectives began to change, not through formal policy declaration, but through the inexorable logic of American institutional momentum applied to an environment that resisted it. More forces meant more operations. More operations required more targets. More targets required a larger targeting apparatus. A larger targeting apparatus produced more intelligence. More intelligence generated more proposed operations. The cycle accelerated, feeding itself, growing larger with each rotation, driven by institutional pressure to demonstrate results in a conflict that the domestic political environment demanded be seen as progressing. The targeting list became the symbol of this acceleration. In the early campaign, the targeting list was short and specific. Al-Qaeda leadership, Taliban commanders directly linked to the September 11th attacks, specific facilitators, and financiers. These were genuine high-value targets whose elimination served clear strategic purposes. British and Australian SAS participated in operations against these targets with complete confidence that each operation was justified by proportionate strategic value. As the war extended, the targeting list grew. It grew in the way bureaucratic systems grow, by accumulation, by category expansion, by the lowering of thresholds that defined who qualified for inclusion. Names were added not just because they represented genuine strategic threats, but because the system required volume to justify its own existence. Intelligence analysts needed to produce intelligence. Operations officers needed to plan operations. Assault forces needed to conduct raids. The targeting list served all of them, and the list grew to serve their needs. By 2006 and 2007, when American Special Operations tempo was reaching its peak in Afghanistan under the influence of lessons drawn from the Iraq campaign, the targeting list had expanded to include individuals whose connection to terrorism was many steps removed from the strategic core. Mid-level commanders, logistics facilitators, financiers of minimal significance, recruiters operating at the village level, individuals who were genuine threats, but whose removal would have limited strategic impact given the Taliban's demonstrated ability to replace eliminated personnel faster than they could be eliminated. The British and Australian SAS watched this expansion with growing professional concern. Their doctrine was built on a principle that the Americans called patient targeting and the British called surgical precision. The idea that special operations forces were most effective when each operation was preceded by thorough intelligence development, precise targeting assessment, and honest evaluation of whether the mission served strategic purposes proportionate to its costs. This principle had been developed through hard experience in conflicts, where special operations had produced both brilliant successes and catastrophic failures. The British SAS had learned in Northern Ireland, in the Falklands, in the Gulf War, that precision was not merely a tactical virtue, it was a strategic imperative. Every operation that killed the wrong person, that damaged civilian infrastructure, that alienated a neutral population, created enemies faster than it eliminated them. The mathematics of counterinsurgency were merciless. One innocent killed could generate 10 new combatants from the community of the bereaved. The Americans had learned different lessons. Their experience in Iraq, where General Stanley McChrystal had transformed Joint Special Operations Command into a high-tempo targeting machine that conducted multiple operations per night across the country, had produced impressive short-term results in eliminating al-Qaeda in Iraq leadership. The network disruption achieved through sheer operational volume was real and significant. The model was celebrated within American special operations as a template for defeating non-state adversaries. The template was transferred to Afghanistan, with insufficient examination of whether the same approach would produce the same results in a different environment. Afghanistan was not Iraq. The Taliban were not al-Qaeda in Iraq. The tribal and ethnic structures of Pashtun society, the particular relationships between populations and armed groups in the Afghan South and East, the different historical relationship between the Afghan state and foreign military presence. All of these factors made the high-tempo, killing model less applicable and potentially counterproductive in ways that weren't apparent until the consequences had already accumulated. British and Australian SAS officers raised these concerns through professional channels. They produced assessments arguing that the operational tempo was exceeding the intelligence system's capacity to produce reliable targeting and the Afghan population's capacity to absorb disruption without shifting allegiance. These assessments were received, reviewed, and largely set aside in favor of the momentum the system had already generated. The assessments were not primarily moral arguments, though they had moral dimensions. They were professional military arguments made by officers who understood counterinsurgency at the operational level and who saw indicators that current methods were producing strategic deterioration, even as tactical metrics showed improvement. Body counts were rising. Network nodes were being eliminated, but the network was regenerating faster than it was being disrupted. The underlying conditions sustaining the insurgency, the legitimate grievances, the tribal power structures, the corruption of the Afghan government, were untouched by any number of night raids. The targeting list continued to grow. The operational rhythm that American JSOC established in Afghanistan by 2007 and 2008 was, by any objective measure, historically unprecedented in its intensity. Multiple direct action raids per night across the theater, drone strikes supplementing ground operations, an intelligence operations cycle running at industrial speed, consuming targets and producing new ones faster than the strategic situation could absorb the effects. Senior American commanders pointed to the statistics with justifiable pride. The number of Taliban senior leaders eliminated was extraordinary. Network disruption was real. Operational pressure was intense. The British and Australian SAS saw the same statistics and read them differently. They saw the eliminated leaders being replaced within weeks by new leaders who were often younger, more radical, and more motivated by the deaths of their predecessors. They saw villages that had been indifferent to the Taliban becoming reliably supportive after operations that killed non-combatants or damaged property without adequate restitution. They saw an insurgency that should, by the logic of network disruption, have been collapsing under the operational pressure, but was instead growing, spreading to provinces that had been stable, developing new financing and recruiting structures to replace those destroyed. The divergence between the tactical metrics and the strategic reality was the professional issue that British and Australian SAS commanders found impossible to resolve within the alliance framework. They were being asked to participate in operations that their own analysis suggested were making the war harder to win, not easier. The targeting list that drove those operations was the physical embodiment of this strategic misdirection, a document that represented enormous investment in tactical activity that wasn't translating into strategic progress. The relationship between the three special operations communities, American JSOC, British SAS, and Australian SASR, had been built on mutual respect for professional capability and shared strategic purpose. Both conditions were under strain by 2007. The professional respect remained, but had been complicated by growing disagreements about operational approach. The shared strategic purpose had been obscured by the divergence between stated objectives. and actual operations. The British SAS operated under Task Force Black, a joint special operations task force that gave British commanders significant operational autonomy. The Australians operated under Task Force 66, their own special operations command structure. These separate command arrangements had been established partly to preserve Allied operational independence and partly to reflect the genuine differences in national avio and strategic objectives. They became increasingly important as the operational philosophies diverged within these task forces. British and Australian commanders made decisions about which joint operations to participate in, which to decline. The decisions were made on professional grounds. Did the proposed operation meet their standards for intelligence quality, targeting accuracy, proportionality of force, and strategic justification? Increasingly, the answer to one or more of these questions was no. The night raids became the central friction point. American Special Operations night raids in Afghanistan reached a tempo of dozens per week across the theater by 2009 and 2010. Each raid required an intelligence package, a planning cycle, and an assault element. The cumulative effect on the targeting system was that the quality threshold for raid authorization was continuously under pressure from the volume of proposed operations. Intelligence that would have been insufficient to authorize a raid in 2002 was being used to justify operations in 2009. Because the system required the volume, British and Australian SAS officers who reviewed joint operation proposals began identifying a pattern that their intelligence analysts characterized as template targeting. Raids authorized primarily because the compound or the individual fit a pattern associated with Taliban activity, rather than because specific, reliable intelligence confirmed both the target's presence and their qualifying significance. Template targeting was tactically rational within a high-volume system that needed to keep its assault elements employed. It was strategically dangerous because the error rate in pattern-based targeting was substantially higher than in intelligence-led targeting. The consequences of elevated error rates in direct action operations were not abstract. They were documented in district-level assessments, in provincial reconstruction team reports, in the accounts of Afghan government officials who watched their authority erode in communities damaged by raids that killed the wrong people. Every wrong person killed created a specific human network of grief and anger that translated into support for the insurgency. The pattern repeated consistently in district after district, province after province. British SAS commanders began formally objecting to proposed joint operations on grounds that intelligence quality was insufficient to justify the risk of civilian casualties. Australian SASRI commanders did the same. These objections were professional and documented, submitted through proper channels with written assessments that explained the specific intelligence deficiencies that made participation inappropriate. American commanders received these objections with frustration that was sometimes expressed and sometimes contained. The operational pressure they were under was genuine. Senior leadership had committed to metrics that required operational volume. The system had been optimized for throughput, and allied objections to individual operations created friction without addressing the underlying pressure driving the tempo. From the American perspective, the British and Australians were applying a tactical standard that was appropriate for a different kind of conflict and a different level of operational intensity. From the British and Australian perspective, the Americans were applying a tactical standard that was appropriate for a different kind of strategic objective. If the objective was to eliminate as many Taliban fighters as possible, as quickly as possible, then the American approach was internally consistent. If the objective was to create the conditions for a self-sustaining Afghan state with sufficient security capability and popular legitimacy to survive the withdrawal of foreign forces, then the American approach was actively counterproductive, and participating in it made the British and Australian forces complicit in strategic failure. This philosophical divide was not resolvable through negotiation or compromise. It reflected genuinely different assessments of what winning the war required. It was exacerbated by the different organizational cultures of the special operations communities involved. American JSOC had been transformed into a high-speed, direct action organization that measured success in raids per night and network nodes eliminated. The British SAS and Australian SAS had retained their emphasis on patient intelligence development, precise targeting, and the management of second and third-order effects. These were not equivalent approaches with minor differences. They were fundamentally different theories of how special operations contributed to strategic success. The targeting list that covered the operations room walls became impossible to look at without seeing the divergence made manifest. The British and Australian officers saw in those listed names not just intelligence targets, but a strategic hypothesis that eliminating enough people from enough categories would eventually degrade insurgent capability below a threshold of viability. The hypothesis was untested. The evidence for its validity was thin, and the evidence against it was accumulating in every district assessment and every provincial reconstruction report. One senior British SAS officer, whose assessment was later declassified and included in a Parliamentary Intelligence and Security Committee report on Afghan operations, characterized the targeting list as a symptom of strategic confusion mistaken for strategic clarity. The list gave the appearance of purposeful action. It generated metrics that could be reported up the chain of command as progress. It satisfied the institutional need for demonstrable activity, but it represented activity substituted for strategy, motion substituted for direction, and tactical success measured in ways that obscured strategic deterioration. The Australian SASR commanders, who produced similar assessments, used language that was more direct in its practical implications. Their evaluation of the joint targeting architecture, submitted to Australian Special Operations Command in 2008, noted that the current operational tempo was generating collateral damage at rates that exceed any plausible calculation of strategic benefit. This was not an accusation. It was a professional military assessment made by officers who had spent years developing expertise in precisely this kind of analysis. The formal withdrawal from certain categories of joint operations, the moment that became known informally as "we are done," did not happen dramatically or publicly. It happened through the accumulation of individual operational decisions, each made on professional grounds, each documented with appropriate justification, each representing a British or Australian assessment that a proposed joint operation did not meet their standards for participation. Over time, these individual decisions produced a pattern that American commanders could not ignore. The British and Australian Special Operations Forces were no longer participating in the same operational framework. They were conducting their own operations according to their own standards, occasionally cooperating on specific targets that met their criteria, but no longer embedded in the joint targeting cycle that drove American operational tempo. The practical consequences were significant. British and Australian intelligence assets, human networks, and targeting expertise represented genuine capabilities that American operations benefited from. Their withdrawal from the joint framework meant the Americans were operating with less intelligence depth in areas where British and Australian networks were strongest. More importantly, it meant the operations were proceeding without the professional check that Allied participation had provided. The independent assessment by officers with different training and different standards who might identify problems that American planners, embedded in their own system, had stopped seeing that an American Special Operations officer who served in Afghanistan during this period and later wrote a professional military journal assessment of the Allied dynamics described. The British and Australian withdrawal from joint operations as the loss of a mirror. American planners had been able to test their operational logic against Allied officers who shared their objectives, but not their assumptions. When those allies withdrew, the Americans lost the feedback mechanism that could have identified systematic problems before they accumulated into strategic consequences. The mirror was gone. The targeting list grew. The raids continued. And in the villages where those raids occurred, the mathematics of grief and anger continued their inexorable calculation, producing recruits for the insurgency faster than the raids could eliminate. Them got the symbolism of the targeting list carried through every dimension of the breakdown. It was a physical document, printed and updated and pinned to boards in operation centers across Afghanistan, and it represented everything the British and Australian SAS had come to disagree with about American special operations methodology. The list was a theory of war reduced to names and grid coordinates, the assumption that human networks could be defeated by eliminating enough of their members. That complex social systems would collapse if struck with sufficient speed and precision. That the patience required for genuine intelligence development and deliberate targeting was a luxury that operational tempo didn't allow. The British and Australian SAS had a different theory, learned in different conflicts, and refined over generations of operations. Their theory held that in counterinsurgency, the quality of each operation mattered more than its quantity, that a network's human substrate was renewed by the social conditions that sustained it, and could not be permanently degraded by kinetic action alone, that the true objective of special operations in an insurgency environment was to identify and target the specific nodes, whose elimination would actually change the system rather than merely create noise within it. These two theories could coexist as long as they were applied to genuinely complementary objectives within a shared strategic framework. They could not coexist when they produced fundamentally different operational judgments about the same proposed raids, the same targeting packages, the same intelligence assessments. When the theories consistently produced different answers to the question, should we do this operation tonight, the operational alliance became untenable. The British and Australian decision to establish effectively independent operational spheres was not publicly announced and was not the subject of official statements. Publicly, the alliance remained intact. Formal liaison arrangements continued. Intelligence sharing continued within established frameworks. At the political and strategic level, the three nations remained committed to their shared mission in Afghanistan. But at the operational level, at the level where special operations forces make daily decisions about what to do and what not to do, the alliance had fractured along the fault line that had been developing since 2006. The British and Australian SAS were no longer participating in the joint targeting cycle that drove American operations. They were conducting their own operations according to their own standards and declining, with increasing frequency, to participate in operations that didn't meet those standards. The decision carried costs that the British and Australian commanders accepted as preferable to the alternative. Declining to participate in joint operations created friction with American counterparts, who needed the Allied capability and saw the withdrawal as unhelpful at best, obstructionist at worst. It created diplomatic friction at levels above the military that had to be managed carefully. It meant British and Australian forces were sometimes not present for operations they might have influenced toward better outcomes if they had chosen engagement over refusal, but the alternative, participating in operations they assessed as strategically counterproductive and tactically disproportionate, carried greater costs. It meant lending professional credibility and capability to an operational approach that their analysis identified as making the war harder to win. It meant being complicit in the generation of civilian casualties that their assessment said would translate into strategic deterioration. It meant abandoning the professional standards that distinguished their forces from less scrupulous practitioners, and that gave their operations their particular strategic value. The phrase, "we are done," captured something real about the weight of that decision. It was not an angry statement or a diplomatic rupture. It was a quiet, honest recognition that two approaches to the same war had diverged beyond the point where joint operations served the mission. It was the professional integrity of officers who had been trained to tell the truth about what operations were achieving, even when that truth was unwelcome. The transformation that the Afghan experience produced in both the British and Australian special operations communities was significant and lasting. It reinforced their commitment to patient targeting doctrine and their resistance to the high-tempo killing model. It produced formal doctrinal documents that explicitly analyzed the strategic risks of tempo-driven special operations. It created a generation of senior officers who had experienced at close quarters what happened when tactical excellence was divorced from strategic judgment. For the Americans, the transformation was slower and more contested. The institutional momentum of JSOC's Afghanistan operations was substantial, and the metrics they produced were impressive in their own terms. The shift in strategic assessment that the British and Australian withdrawal implied required acknowledging that the entire operational framework had been pursuing the wrong objectives. That acknowledgement was too costly for the institution to make easily or quickly. The war continued. The targeting list continued to grow and shrink and grow again with each passing year. The British and Australian forces conducted their own operations, sometimes cooperating with American forces on specific targets, maintaining the formal architecture of alliance while operating independently on the matters that had driven the fracture. The alliance endured in form as the operational relationship evolved into something more complicated and more honest. The mountains of Afghanistan absorbed all of this without comment. They had seen conquerors before: Macedonian, Mughal, British, Soviet, and they had outlasted them all. They had no investment in which theory of counterinsurgency was correct. They simply persisted while the theories were tested against the reality of a conflict that resisted every framework imposed upon it. The targeting list, its growth and its limitations, its tactical logic and its strategic costs, became in retrospect the clearest symbol of the Afghan war's fundamental problem: the confusion of activity with achievement, the substitution of measurable tactical success for genuine strategic progress, the industrial application of lethal force to a problem. That lethal force could damage but not solve. Freedom is a fragile thing to build in a country that has never known it in the modern sense. It requires more than the elimination of its enemies. It requires the construction of conditions, social, political, economic, institutional, within which it can take root and grow. Those conditions cannot be created by raids, however precise, or by targeting lists, however comprehensive, or by the application of special operations capability, however exceptional. The British and Australian SAS understood this, having learned it through experience in conflicts where the lesson had been hard won. They had watched counterinsurgency succeed in Malaya and fail in Aden, had watched patience and population focus produce results in Borneo that firepower and tempo had not produced in other environments. They had institutional memory of the difference between special operations that served genuine strategic objectives and special operations that generated metrics while those objectives drifted unreached. When they said, "We are done," they were not abandoning the alliance or the mission. They were honoring both by refusing to participate in operations that their professional analysis said were undermining the mission the alliance existed to accomplish. That refusal was its own form of fidelity to the soldiers serving under them, to the Afghan people affected by every raid, to the strategic objectives that the war had been fought to achieve. The mountains remember nothing. The targeting lists are classified and archived, their names now meaningless. the intelligence that generated them long overtaken by subsequent events. The special operations forces that operated in those mountains have rotated home, been recognized, been promoted, and in some cases have spoken carefully about what they saw and what they concluded. What they concluded was not comfortable for any of the nations involved. It was the conclusion that operational excellence and strategic wisdom are different qualities, that possessing one does not guarantee the other, and that the alliance between nations with shared values but different operational philosophies is most tested not by the enemy's capability, but by the difficulty of maintaining honest disagreement without fracturing the larger purpose that makes the alliance worth preserving. We are done. 3 words that contained multitudes. The end of a particular kind of joint operation. The beginning of a different kind of honest relationship. The professional judgment of soldiers who had been trained above all else to see clearly, and who saw in the end that what they were being asked to do was not what they had been called to accomplish. The targeting list gathered dust in the archive. The mountains endured, and in the quiet of offices where doctrines are written and lessons are codified, the fracture in Afghanistan left its permanent mark on how the English-speaking alliance understands the limits of special operations. The dangers of tactical success, divorced from strategic judgment, and the rare, costly form of courage required to tell powerful allies the truth about what their methods are achieving, when the truth is the last thing they want to hear.